Chapter 5 The Slave Trade. How and why it started. To understand the African slave trade, we must understand slavery as an institution almost as old as human society. Every people, sometime or another, have been slaves. In fact, Europeans enslaved other Europeans for a much longer period than they enslaved Africans. Slavery was a permanent feature of the ancient world in Egypt, Kush, and Rome. The African slave period is best known to us because it is the best documented. However, these documents are often confusing because they were created by people who were trying to justify the slave trade. Most people, especially Europeans who created most of the documents on slave trade, write about the subject with the intent to make the victim of slavery feel guilty and to vindicate the perpetrators of the slave trade. There's probably more dishonesty related to the interpretation of this subject than any other subject known to man. The African slave trade, like African history, is often written about but rarely understood. This misunderstanding probably grows out of the fact that we nearly always start the study of the African slave trade in the wrong place. The germ, the motive, the rationale for the African slave trade started in the minds of the Europeans in the 15th and the 16th centuries. The slave trade could not have started at all had there been no market for it. The slave trade started when the Europeans began to expand out into the broader world. The market was created by Europeans for European reasons. The story of the African slave trade is essentially the story of the consequences of the second rise of Europe. In the years between the passing of the Roman Empire in the 8th century and the partial unification of Europe through the framework of the Catholic Church in the 15th century, Europeans were engaged mainly in internal matters. With the opening of the New World and the expulsion of the Arabs and the Moors from Spain during the later part of the 15th century, the Europeans started to expand beyond their homeland into the broader world. They were searching for new markets, new materials, new manpower, and new land to exploit. The African slave trade was created to accommodate this expansion. The basis for European Industrial Revolution had already been established. They had already created an embryo technology, including the gun. In the years that followed, they also used other advantages, mainly a large fleet of ships and rabble soldiers and sailors with no sentimental attachment to non-Europe people, to take over most of the world. In so doing, they destroyed a large number of nations and civilizations that were older than any in Europe. The main problem with the African in dealing with the European during this early period was the African's tragic naivety. He had never dealt extensively with this kind of people. He came out of a society where nature was kind. Nature furnished him enough food, enough land, enough of the basic things he needed to live a pretty good life. These old African societies were governed by honor and obligation. Land could neither be bought or sold. There were no fights over the ownership of the land. The land belonged to everyone. The European, coming from a society where nature was rather stingy and where he had to compete with his brother for his breakfast, his land and his woman, had acquired a competitive nature that the African could not deal with. In order to justify the destruction of these African societies, a monster that still haunts our lives was created. This monster was racism. The slave trade and the colonial system that followed are the parents of this catastrophe. The Europeans, mainly the Portuguese, who came to the west coast of Africa in the 15th century, were not at first looking for slaves. The search for gold and other treasures lured them to Africa. They did not have to fight their way into the continent. They came as guests and were treated as guests. Then they grew strong, decided to be conquerors, and turned on their host. Another myth we have to dispel is that the Europeans came to Africa to spread civilization. Actually, most of the great civilization in Africa declined after the coming of the Europeans. For years, the Europeans had been hearing rumors about African cities of gold and beautiful women. There were also legends circulating in Europe about a great emperor in Ethiopia called Prester John. But when the Portuguese arrived in Africa, Prester John had been dead for 300 years, and they looked for him on one side of Africa, and he had been on the other. But no European came to Africa to tame any raw savage. When the Europeans first saw the cities of Africa, they reported that these cities were well designed and that the African was civilized to the marrow of his bones. 50 years later, when they wanted to justify the slave trade, they started the myth about savage Africa, with no organized societies, no cities, even no knowledge of the wheel. The European did not enter Africa to bring civilization. In fact, no nation ever invaded another nation for any reason other than to exploit that nation for its own reasons. This is true even when whites invade whites. It's true when browns invade browns. And it's also true when blacks invade blacks. The intent of every invader, no matter what his color, is to establish his own way of life, and in nearly every case, the local culture suffers. This happened when the Europeans invaded the west coast of Africa. We have their word that they did not meet an uncivilized people. We also have their word that they encountered not only well-organized societies, but societies that had a great deal of order and beauty. In 1434, a small fleet of Portuguese ships sailed down the coast of Africa and established some trading posts. By 1441, they were taking some of the tropical riches of out of Africa and also a few slaves they bought who had been prisoners of war captured in some local skirmish among Africans. By 1482, they had built the fortress of Elima Castle, the beginning of forts built by Europeans along the coast of West Africa to protect themselves from the Africans when the slave trade was established. In fact, the slave trade did not really get underway until the Europeans had these fortresses built. And while building the forts with the help of Africans, they were telling the Africans that they had come to deal in honorable trade at the Nave. Africans believed this story. These fortresses actually served as holding stations for the slaves that they were shipping to the New World. Incidentally, the Scandinavians entered the slave trade after the Portuguese, but they did not have any appreciable success, and they became middlemen in the slave trade. Then, when the Arabs and Moors were expelled from Spain, they returned to Africa. After being the masters of the Mediterranean for 750 years, they had no sentimental attachment to Africa. They began to prey on the nations south of the Sahara, principally the old empire of Shanghai. They first claimed the salt mines, for salt was then so precious that traders gave 2 parts of gold for 1 part of salt. They sent troops from what is now Morocco down into this area. The fight over the salt mines at Tanhaza on the edge of the Sahara Desert became a great political and economic struggle. But something else happened. 2. Christopher Columbus had by sheer accident started to look for the East Indies and instead found what was later called the West Indies. A new world was open to Europeans, and they promptly began their exploitation. Chapter 6. Times of Trouble. Africa times of tragedy and decline started both in Europe and in Africa itself. For more than 1,000 years, Africa has been bringing into being empire after empire. But the opening of Europe's era of exploration, Africa's own internal strife, and the slave trade turned what had been Africa's golden age into a time of troubles. The Crusades may be called the beginning of Europe's reawakening. A religious fervor, not unrelated to politics, had stirred Europeans out of their lethargy and their indifference to the larger world. The first Crusades began in 1095, was precipitated by the Seljuk Turks, whose persecution of the Christians had placed even Constantinople in jeopardy. The eastern heads of the church appealed to Pope Urban II for help. At a great church council in France, the Pope pointed out that if Constantinople fell to the Turks, Western Europe would soon be overthrown. He made an eloquent plea to the kings and princes gathered and to all Western European Christendom, to rally to the aid of the Christians in the East and to drive the infidels from the Holy Land. This religious crisis gave Europe a semblance of unity, and although it can be said that the Crusades were military and religious failures, they did provide the opportunity to bring new information to Europe. The religious wars also had a profound effect on the political development of Europe. The Western monarchies were able to strengthen their authority and develop a strong central government, while many members of their turbulent aristocracies were fighting in the Holy Land. Contact with the East had a deep and lasting effect on the Crusaders, who belonged to a civilization where culture and learning had almost vanished during the Dark Ages. The princes in their castles and the peasants in their huts were equally ignorant and uneducated. When they arrived in the East, they soon realized how backwards were the people of the West. They marveled at the beautiful cities, the thriving commerce, the busy industry, the art, and the learning. The impetus for exploration was fueled by what the Crusaders met along the way. Ships built to ferry the Crusaders to the Holy Land returned laden with the products of the East. The cargoes of spices, fruits, rich silks, satins, velvets, and other luxury goods had found a ready market. Thus, the Crusades brought into being the first attempt to open fresh trade routes to the East. Early in the 15th century, Europeans, such of new worlds to conquer and of a food supply to feed the continent's hungry population, began to venture across the seas. North Africa. By 1492, North Africa was confronted with the painful fact of its waning influence in the Mediterranean Europe. Spain and Portugal, which had broken the yoke of North African domination, were asserting themselves as a powerful, independent nation with colonial aspirations in the lands of their former conquerors. Islam, a great religion and military force in North Africa and the Middle East since the latter part of the 7th century, was torn apart by eternal strife and bickering. The relationship of North Africa to people of the Western Sudan was deteriorating. For hundreds of years, this relationship had been good. Africans from the Western Sudan had participated in large number in the conquest of Spain in the year AD 711. These Africans made up the majority military force that kept Spain under North African domination, and they participated in that country's intellectual life, as it is still reflected in Spain's art, culture, and literature. In order to understand this neglected aspect of history, the role of Africans in the conquering and ruling of Spain, it is necessary to go back in time to retell, at least briefly, the part that black Africans played in the rise of Islam and in the spread of Islamic influence to the Mediterranean Europe. After consolidating their position in Spain, the Muslims began to establish institutions of research and learning, whose brilliance was far beyond Spain's borders. This was an achievement not of the Arabs alone. It was brought into being by a combination of Africans and Arabs, collectively referred to by Europeans as Moors. The word Moor entered the vocabulary of the Europeans, meaning black, as in blackamoor. By the end of the 4th century, Southern Europe had gained enough strength, military and otherwise, to challenge their African and Arab masters. By the end of the 15th century, the Arabs and Moors had lost all Spain except the kingdom of Granada. The Christians, although they also had their internal disputes, were finally united. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella joined the formerly hostile royal houses of Aragon and Castile, and together their forces blockaded the city of Granada. After 8 months, the Moorish governor finally surrendered. This marked the end of an era. Europe had literally been reborn. The Africans who had planted the seed of progress in Southern Europe had not made the best use of the harvest that followed. The progress and excitement that had inspired Europe during the 15th century and had carried medieval Europe over into the modern world had brought no progressive changes to North Africa, now rocked with conflict. In the countries of North Africa, especially in Morocco, political stagnation seemed to be the general rule, and strong men with selfish intent found their opportunity to seize power. They no longer protected the poets and scholars. They left no monuments to embellish the conquered cities. To North Africans, the 15th century was a time in which Spain was a lost and hated land, a century in which Portugal robbed North Africa of a large part of its western seacoast. The news in 1492 of Christopher Columbus' discovery of the New World came swiftly to the courts of Fez, Marrakech, and Cairo, and was no cause for rejoicing.